Hi, Niall Paterson here in the Sky News Daily Studio. Today, we're returning to a story we've covered before on the podcast, but with some fresh revelations. Russian sanctions. Now, you remember, a whole raft of them were introduced around about 2 years ago, shortly after Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. The purpose of those sanctions was, in essence, twofold. First and foremost, of course, to limit the Russian war machine, but second, to try and starve those Russian oligarchs of access to luxury goods, including cars. Our economics editor had noticed that sales of British vehicles to Russia fell away completely after those sanctions were introduced, but sales to former Soviet states had dramatically increased. The suspicion was, of course, that those cars then somehow made their way into Russia, but we didn't know how until now. Our economics editor is, of course, Ed Conway. And Ed, as so often happens in your world, this all began with a graph.
It started with a data point, and in this case, we were kind of looking, and we've been looking at this for quite some time, at what's happening to UK trade with Russia after those sanctions were imposed. So obviously sanctions were imposed on all sorts of items when Russia invaded Ukraine. And those sanctions included things like high-value goods, like cars. It included luxury items. But it also included dual-use goods, so weapons and things like that. But you saw a really unprecedented increase in these kinds of things. So luxury cars, drone equipment, radar equipment. You saw a massive increase in those kind of goods going to the Caucasus states, so Azerbaijan and Georgia. And the problem with the chart is it kind of doesn't tell you what happens next. I mean, you can look at those numbers and say, we can presume that stuff is probably going into Russia via the back door, but the trail just goes cold. And so we wanted to explore why.
And of course, from that initial graph, it became obvious that the sanctions weren't quite having the effect that they were supposed to have. And we were told these were world-beating sanctions. These were sanctions that could not be gotten around. We
were told they were absolutely unprecedented in terms of how the severity. And there's also financial sanctions. So a lot of Russian assets that are held overseas have been frozen. Plus, on top of that, if there are individuals who have been sanctioned. But the problem is, it looks leaky. And the issue for us, as journalists is, you can look at this chart and it says, loads of cars that were previously going to Russia are suddenly going to Azerbaijan. We know that the Azerbaijani economy doesn't necessarily look like it's able to accommodate this incredible influx of luxury vehicles, because it is mostly luxury vehicles. It seems a bit kind of unlikely. But because the chart says that, various people, including the car lobby group, are able to say, oh, no, actually, Azerbaijan is doing pretty well. And so who are we to presume that this stuff is going to Russia? The data doesn't say it's going to Russia.
Why the focus on luxury cars? I mean, why do we care if someone in Russia is driving, a Jaguar Land Rover, Range Rover?
The first reason is they are sanctioned very explicitly. Any car over a certain value, so anything that's a luxury car, is sanctioned. And the reason for that, in this case, is the idea was that if you're one of Putin's cronies, if you're someone who is helping to support the regime and you like nice European luxury things, European luxury fashion, or indeed luxury cars, you shouldn't really be able to get them. And it's just trying to stifle off those who are supportive of the regime there and make it less fun to be in Russia. But I think actually in this case, there's a broader thing, which is that this is, if we could show that these cars are actually going to Russia, that they're not just staying in the Caucasus, it would be an interesting and useful proxy to show that other stuff is probably getting into Russia via the back door in the same way as well. And the reason why cars, I mean, it's quite simple. It's very hard to hide a car. And so if we can prove that point about cars, then we can also prove this deeper point, which is that these are the pathways whereby stuff is getting into Russia, stuff which ends up then providing the weaponry which is killing Ukrainians. And so it's not just cars. We're not just being prurient about the cars. It's not just saying, oh, look at all of these smart cars. It's saying this is showing that the regime, the sanctions regime, isn't as effective as we have been told.
So tell us then, Ed, about the final link in the chain. I mean, you got a tip. I've got this image of you sitting private eye style in a dark, smoke-filled room, reaching for a ringing Bakelite phone, picking it up in some gravelly voice at the end saying, Ed, you've got to head to Georgia.
So this is basically in the north of Georgia. There is one border between Georgia and Russia, and it's a place called Lars checkpoint. It is beautiful. It's the Caucasus mountain range, very high peaks, snow-capped mountains, higher actually than anything in the Alps. Beautiful green meadows in the valleys, wildflowers as far as you can see. It's a very beautiful place actually, and we got some photos of lots of Porsches and Mercedes and actually some Lexuses as well. They're waiting there at the border, and some of them still had their factory wrappings on, so they were clearly new. Mm-hmm. And alongside them, there were 2 Range Rovers, and we thought, okay, well that's significant because that's showing this is a British-made car. It's actually made in the UK. Within a couple of weeks, we were out there in Georgia, heading up from Tbilisi, which is the capital, up this long, winding, quite beautiful road towards the border, wondering, are those cars still going to be there?
What did you find then?
The first thing to say is we saw lots and lots of luxury cars sitting there. If you're talking about 150, 200,000 pounds for the top specs of the G-Wagon, sometimes even more. There was a Mercedes Maybach, which starting price £177,000. This is not a car park in Mayfair. Uh-huh. This is not Mayfair. This is not Dubai. It is a pretty scuzzy border post, you know, and these are kind of unofficial little car parks where you've just kind of got gravel in them. By some forlorn cafe where you can barely buy anything and there's nowhere to go to the loo. But the point is, this is not like a super salubrious place, and yet you've got these incredibly smart cars there. And yeah, that's within a few hundred yards or less of the actual border post. And we expected when we got there that there would be a lot of security and a lot of people saying, you know, turn your cameras off, keep away. But actually, no, everyone was kind of unexpectedly quite relaxed about it. And I guess that talks to the fact that they've never really had to be scrutinised. No one has come there to say, don't be doing this stuff. The cars just come in and they go out. And there is a well-oiled process whereby these cars, they're shifted up. One team takes them up to the border. One person and one team takes them up in a carrier, so they're on the back of a truck. They get to the border, they sit in a car park for a moment. Then another kind of middleman takes the cars. They need by then to have a bit of their paperwork done, and there's a bit of a jiggery-pokery around that paperwork. And then they get transit plates put onto them. Then another middleman drives the car across the border. Hey, I'm just taking this car across, it's mine. They say, where are you taking it? They are advised a lot of the time to say, I'm taking it to Kyrgyzstan, sometimes maybe Kazakhstan. And the border official goes...
Why would they be recommended to do that?
Because then it doesn't officially look like it's going to Russia. Because everyone knows, and you know, everyone knows what's happening here. The cars are going to Russia. Everyone knows this. But you need, in order to maintain plausible deniability, to say, no, it's going to Kyrgyzstan. And there is a long and winding road that takes you a long way up into Russia, not quite to Moscow, but almost, and around the Caspian Sea, and eventually you find your way towards Kyrgyzstan, you know, a few thousand miles later. But no one believes that that's actually where these cars are going. So then this middleman takes them across the border, puts them in another car park on the other side of the border. The middleman goes back across to the Georgian side, maybe takes another car later on, and then that car is now in Russia. And lo and behold, another car carrier can come down from Moscow or wherever it is and pick up that car and take it up into wherever it's going, whether it's Moscow, St. Petersburg or elsewhere. And the car is in Russia and the job is done. And what's kind of unique and special about this process is that it means the car doesn't show up in the customs data, because one person is taking each car across and it looks like an individual just taking their car across. And it's magic. And what you're seeing here is this extraordinary process of, in the face of sanctions, how goods are still getting into Russia.
A good point, Ed, for us to take a breather. We'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. Ed Conway still with us, running us through how luxury cars are circumventing that Russian sanction scheme. And Ed, look, given the scale of the operation you and the team witnessed, isn't it unfair to say that, you know, people are taking advantage of a loophole? They are simply ignoring the sanctions regime, isn't it?
Well, it's kind of an industrial loophole. Lots of small traders, brokers have come across from Russia who are now working in Georgia, running these kinds of operations. And some of the cars, you know, the tough thing is getting new cars in. Almost all of the ones we saw were new. But there's also secondhand. There's a big secondhand market as well. And also, if you're in Russia and you've got something like a Range Rover or a Mercedes, You need to get it serviced. Sometimes you might have to take it down into Georgia to get it serviced because the cars are legal in Georgia. They're not supposed to be new cars are not supposed to be serviced in Russia. So there is a whole business. And the striking thing about this, Neil, is that if you look at Georgian GDP and for that matter Azerbaijani GDP, these countries are doing amazing right now. Their economies are doing really well. And part of the explanation for that is this trade. You've got lots of people who are now employed to get stuff through the Caucasus into Russia. And it's mostly German cars. But we didn't see the Range Rovers that we had been sent pictures of. So we thought to ourselves, OK, well, it's probable that they've gone over the border, given there's only one direction which these cars are going in. But we didn't have kind of visual proof of that. And so we were kind of thinking, OK, well, we stuck around for a couple of days. But then eventually we thought, well, we can't wait forever. And so we headed back down towards Tbilisi. And then we drove and drove and drove. And actually, it was a good 2.5 hours driving down the mountain, getting to the outskirts of Tbilisi. And then suddenly we see not just one, but a convoy of these car carriers, each single car carriers coming the other direction. We're like, oh, hang on, that's a Porsche, that's a Mercedes. Is that a Range Rover? And so we literally skidded almost, turned the car around, and then gave chase really to this. It was 2 Range Rovers on a couple of these carriers.
How did we know that those Range Rovers were manufactured here?
On the windscreen of most, at least UK cars, there's a VIN number. So it's kind of the serial number of the car, the fingerprints. And so we took those VIN numbers, and you can check using the VIN number where it's manufactured and when. So we could do that instant check, and we looked at it, and these were made in 2024 in Solihull. So we knew at that point these were post-sanction cars, and we knew that they were brand new. In fact, one of them had a bit of paperwork on one of the seats saying it was April 2024. We did our checks and we took all the numbers, and because we also wanted to send them to Jaguar Land Rover to say, look, this is what's happening to your cars. Are you okay with this? They have sanctions teams. JLR has sanctions teams, Mercedes, all of these companies have sanctions teams who are trying, I think, very sincerely to try and clamp down on this. It is a massive, massive market. It is a big industrial process. And the upshot of all of this as well is these are not small numbers of cars going into the business.
No, not at all.
These are not small numbers. Like I was looking just at the latest month, July, it was £33 million in a single month. Over the year as a whole, you're talking about hundreds of millions of pounds of exports. So this affects the UK economy.
Yeah.
These are cars that are giving people a livelihood working, in the Midlands and elsewhere to make, which are in turn ending up in Russia. And everyone, I think, this is what makes this, I think, a very uncomfortable story. We're kind of part of this. No one wants to be part of this, but it is happening. And there is no easy button you can press to stop it happening. We shouted to one of the people who was taking the car, where's the car going? And he said, where do you think it's going? To Paris?
But I mean, you say this, but there are even Russian YouTubers out there talking pretty openly about the way in which you can make money through essentially smuggling Range Rovers.
Yeah, there's YouTubers, there's people on Instagram as well who explain in some depth about the process and explain along the way, by the way, you need to tell them it's going to Kyrgyzstan, but everyone knows, everyone from the border post official to the people who are processing it, everyone knows this car is going to end up in Russia, and you won't have any problems once you bring it in there, and you can get it registered and everything is fine. And the upshot of all of it is you've got a lot of people making money along the way, and people in Russia are still able to get those nice luxury cars that they always wanted. It may cost them a tiny bit more because they need to pay some third parties along the way. It might take a little bit longer to get in. But in the scheme of things, it's not a massive inconvenience. And it's not like there is massive hardship that's ostensible in Moscow as a result of these sanctions. Life seems kind of to go on. But if the whole debate about this was, we have got various tools and we're using it to wage economic war, we're not having a direct military war with Russia, but we, the West, the G7, are trying to wage economic war with Russia, then I think it's a legitimate question to ask, is it working? And this is a pretty clear-cut bit of evidence that no, it's really not.
But isn't there even a bigger question on top of that? That if the borders are so porous, if the sanctions regime is so obviously not fit for purpose, doesn't that mean that those other items which could be assisting with the war effort are very, very likely to be on the back of those trucks that you saw queuing at the border.
Yeah, and that's the spooky and frustrating thing. Like I said earlier, the reason we're looking at cars is that you can see them. The data doesn't exist. We know that. What we do know is a lot of stuff, parts, electronics, is going from the UK and from Europe. It's going into these Caucasus states. And the next thing, and that's kind of where that data trail goes cold. We can't spot it going in the trucks because, it's just an opaque truck. But the next thing we know, a few months later, this stuff is turning up on the battlefield in Ukraine. Yeah, and it's killing people.
Is there a solution to this? But actually, stuff that. I mean, the question is the sanctions regime merely performative? Is it just, have our politicians done it because we expect them to do something like that at a time like this? Is it so they can send out a statement to people like you and say, we are trying?
I mean, listen, this is the most depressing story I've ever covered. I think there's a deeper kind of question at the base of all of this, which is that are people in Europe, and I say Europe more broadly, because actually the UK, really Germany is a bigger part of this story. We are sending cars to Russia. We've shown that. But Germany is sending even more. Germany is sending even more goods to Russia. Germany is importing even more Russian gas via LNG in particular. Are we ready in Europe to have the kind of economic sacrifice it would really entail if you were really going to economic war with Russia? Because if you were seriously going to economic war with Russia, you wouldn't be importing any of their gas. You'd be completely forswearing any oil. And as a result of that, your energy prices, which, by the way, gas prices have come down to more or less where they were before the invasion, your gas prices are going up again. The energy price shock we've just kind of escaped from is back. The cost of living crisis is back. And your manufacturers are suddenly losing one of their customers. And so hundreds of millions of pounds of exports from the UK are gone. Are we really ready for that? That's the question. And I'm afraid the answer, as revealed by what has happened over the past 2 years, is no. And so, unfortunately, to some extent, I think the sanctions regime is, in practice, somewhat performative. And it's quite revealing of the realpolitik of this, which is that Europe isn't quite ready for those degrees of sacrifice. It isn't ready also, by the way, to take on Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, to some extent Georgia as well, and to say, listen, we're going to sanction you as well. That's nowhere near anyone's kind of game plan at the moment, because they want to keep these countries on side. Because if they don't keep them on side, then lo and behold, look what's happening. They're getting pulled closer towards Russia. So it's tricky. It's really tricky, and I can't think of a kind of easy answer to this. But what I do know is that this is part of the explanation for why Russia is still doing pretty well and is still able to wage war and has 4 missiles for every missile that the Ukrainians have, and for why this war is ongoing and it's still very tough for Ukraine, who, by the way, obviously, at the same time as us buying oil indirectly off Russia and gas indirectly off Russia, or directly in the case of Europe, we are also providing military assistance to Ukraine. So it's a very perverse, uncomfortable situation.
Thank you, Ed. Now, of course, we did reach out to Jaguar Land Rover for comment. A spokesperson for JLR said this: JLR stopped sales of vehicles to Russia and Belarus in February 2022. An ongoing investigation into these vehicles has confirmed they were not supplied by JLR to the Georgia market. They were supplied by JLR to retailers in countries that do not share a border with Russia, and then in turn sold to customers in those countries, which are subject to similar sanctions and export controls as we are in the UK in relation to Russia. The statement concludes: JLR, along with its retailer network, continues to adapt its compliance strategies to counter the efforts of third parties seeking to circumvent sanctions against Russia and Belarus. We also asked the government for comment. They said this: the UK has banned the export of thousands of goods to Russia, including cars. Over £20 billion worth of UK trade with Russia is now under sanctions, and we will continue to ratchet up economic pressure until it ends its brutal invasion of Ukraine. We are also working with UK businesses and exporters to ensure sanctioned goods are not supplied to Russia, and we expect them to continue to check their compliance with relevant UK sanctions. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We're back again tomorrow.